There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock, it doesn't leave notes. It simply settles into the corners of a house, behind the coffee cups that only ever hold one person's fingerprints, inside the silence that follows a closed door at night, beneath the sound of wind pressing against windows nobody bothered to open in years. I've ridden through a patchy country alone. I've camped under skies so enormous they made me feel like a mistake. I've watched men die holding things they never got to give: letters, apologies, the edge of someone's sleeve. And I'll tell you this honestly, with my logbook open and my handwriting worse than usual because my hand still shakes when I think about it. The loneliest thing I ever witnessed wasn't in any wilderness. It was in a house with good furniture. A house where a man sat at a table every morning with 2 chairs and used only one. Where a woman arrived in the spring like a bird that wasn't sure it had the right nest. Where 2 people, both afraid of the same silence, both reaching for the same kind of warmth, tried very hard not to call it what it was. I was there for most of it. I saw the contract. I watched him rehearse being practical. I watched her rehearse being grateful. I watched them fail at both. What happened between Caleb Hart and Nara Swiftwind in that ranch house on the edge of the New Mexico high desert wasn't clean or simple or the kind of story you'd put on a postcard. There were days it looked like 2 people talking past each other in different languages with the same wounded expression. There were nights that felt like doors slamming in rooms nobody walked into anymore. But there were also other moments, small ones, the kind you don't notice until much later when you're writing them down by firelight and your throat tightens without warning. I'm Denny Crow. I keep logs because I don't trust my memory, and I don't trust my feelings to stay still long enough to examine them without paper. I've been writing for Caleb's ranch since before the dry years. I was there when he drew up the arrangement. I was there when she stepped off the stage with one bag and a look on her face like she was already preparing herself for disappointment. I watched the whole thing. I want to tell it straight, I'll do my best. But I'll warn you now, by the end, my handwriting got worse again. The morning Caleb Hart rode into town to finalize the arrangement, he ironed his shirt. I know because I was in the barn when he came out of the house with it on, and it was so stiff and deliberate, that shirt, that I stopped what I was doing with the bridle and just looked at him for a moment. Caleb was not an ironing man. Caleb was a man who wore whatever was on top of the pile, who'd ridden through 3 dust storms in the same coat without complaint, who once bandaged a gash on his forearm with a strip of flour sack and went back to fixing fence posts the same afternoon. But that morning the shirt was ironed. "You're going to town?" I said, not a question. "Yes," he said, not offering anything further. I went back to the bridle. He tacked up his bay, Reddick, with the same efficiency he applied to everything, cinched tight, no wasted movement, no ceremony. He'd always been like that. Since his wife died 3 years prior, since the ranch shrunk from a family operation to a one-man endurance test, Caleb had become a man who moved like he was conserving something essential. Like every gesture had to justify its own cost. He'd lost Margaret in the winter, fever that came fast and went faster. Left behind a 4-year-old named Eli who was now 7 and asking questions that Caleb answered with increasing precision and decreasing warmth. Not because he didn't love the boy, God, he loved the boy, but because he'd constructed a careful wall between himself and anything that might soften him further. He'd already been softened once. He'd seen where that led. So he'd made a practical decision. A wife, an arrangement. The territorial papers called it a household partnership agreement. The lawyer in town, a thin man named Orvins who smelled of pipe smoke and old disappointments, had drawn it up with the careful language of commerce. Services rendered. Domestic management, child supervision, financial stability provided in exchange for presence and labor. Caleb had reviewed it twice and signed it with his ordinary working signature. No flourish, no hesitation. I found out the details later, from Orvins himself, who told me over a beer because small towns have no secrets and old lawyers have no filter. The woman, Nara Swiftwind, had responded to the territorial advertisement through a letter so composed and careful that Orvins had commented on it. She was Apache, half-blood, 26, from a situation that was never fully explained but which involved a cousin's household in Santa Fe that had become, over the course of 2 years, quietly untenable. She'd worked as a seamstress and before that, as a kitchen assistant at a territorial hotel. Her letter had asked 4 questions about the child, 2 questions about the land, and none about Caleb himself. He'd found that either admirable or worrying, maybe both. He'd agreed to the arrangement without meeting her. She arrived on a Tuesday in April. I was the one sent to collect her from the stage, because Caleb had a water line that had burst that morning and because, I think, he wanted a few more hours of not yet having to begin. I'd brought the flat wagon, which in retrospect was an unfortunate choice. It bounced badly on the rutted road from town and had a broken board on the left side bench that I'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. I stood outside the stage office with my hat in my hands and a note that said her name, which Caleb had written in his careful, upright handwriting as though even the letters were conserving energy. She was the 3rd person off the stage. I recognized her from the way she looked at the town, not with wonder, not with relief, but with the patient assessment of someone who'd learned early that first impressions of places were only the beginning of a much longer negotiation. She was carrying 1 canvas bag. It was not a large bag. Whatever she'd brought of herself from Santa Fe, it fit in 1 canvas bag, and she carried it with both hands because the handle strap had been mended twice and wasn't reliable. She saw the note before I could raise it. "Crow," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Denny Crow, I work for." "I know," she said. "Is it far?" "About 40 minutes on the wagon." She looked at the wagon. She looked at the broken bench board. She didn't say anything about it. We rode out mostly in silence, which suited me because I didn't know what to offer. I'd been told almost nothing except that she was coming and to treat her with respect, which was Caleb's way of saying that whatever this was, it mattered, even if he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge how much. I kept my logbook in my jacket pocket. I didn't take it out. I watched the road. About halfway, she said, "The boy, Eli, what is he like?" I thought about it. "Quiet," I said. "Reads a lot, asks questions about things that happened before he was alive." She nodded slowly. "Does he know I'm coming?" His father told him there would be a woman coming to help run the house. Silence. "Help run the house," she repeated. Not bitterly, not with challenge, just weighing it. The way you weigh a word when you want to know exactly what's inside it. I didn't have anything better to offer her, so I kept my eyes on the road and my mouth shut, and she kept her hands folded over the canvas bag in her lap, and we came over the low ridge and down into the valley where the Hart Ranch sat square house, 2 outbuildings, a windmill working slowly against the afternoon sky, and I heard her breathe in very quietly. Not in awe, more like bracing. Caleb was waiting on the porch. He'd washed, changed back into the ironed shirt, I noticed, though it had acquired a small smear of rust-colored mud on the left cuff from the water line work. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, which was how he stood when he was making himself not cross them. They looked at each other. I've seen negotiations between Apache chiefs and territorial officials with more visible warmth, but I've also seen less. What passed between Caleb Hart and Nara Swiftwind in that first wordless moment on the porch was something I've turned over in my logbook many times since, trying to name it accurately. They were both taking stock, both measuring the distance between what had been agreed on paper and what was standing in front of them now, in the physical, complicated, breathing reality of actual humans. He'd known she was Apache, but knowing it in a letter and seeing it, her dark eyes, her straight posture, the quiet authority she held even while carrying a bag with a mended handle strap, were different things. And she'd known he was a Widwer rancher, but knowing it in a letter and seeing him, the set of his jaw, the mud on his cuff, the way his grief had thinned his face into something that looked very nearly like stoicism, but wasn't quite, were also different things. "Miss Swiftwind," he said. "Mr. Hart," she said. Eli appeared at Caleb's elbow. 7 years old, all serious eyes and uncombed hair, holding a book he hadn't been reading. He'd been listening for the wagon from 20 minutes out, I'd wager. He looked at Nara for a long moment. "You have mud on your shoe," he told her. She looked down. The left boot. There was indeed a streak of red clay along the toe from where she'd stepped wrong getting onto the wagon. "I do," she said. "There's a scraper by the door," he said, and went back inside. I watched something almost happen on Caleb's face, almost a smile or almost an apology or almost both, and then he controlled it. "Come in," he said. "I'll show you the house." She scraped her boot on the iron at the doorstep, precisely, and followed him inside. I didn't go in. It wasn't my place, and it wasn't my business, but I stayed close enough to the bunkhouse to be useful if needed, and I wrote in my log that evening with the kind of uncertainty that makes a man's handwriting cramped. She has one bag. He has one expression. The boy has one book. I don't know what this is going to be. The next week was careful, politely, exhaustingly careful. Nara learned the house quickly. She was sharp, organized, moved through rooms like she was memorizing the distance between things. She cooked simply and well. She fixed the bench strap on Eli's chair that had been wobbling for months. She found the supply list that Caleb kept in the kitchen drawer and reorganized it by category without being asked, which he noticed without commenting. He was formal with her, scrupulously so. He said thank you when meals were set out. He told her his schedule at the beginning of each week, days in the field, days in town, days managing cattle, so she could plan around him. He asked her once if the room was adequate, and she said yes, and he said good, and that was the longest personal conversation they had in the first 5 days. What I observed, from my careful outside position, was the performance of two people being very reasonable. Both of them working very hard at it. The first crack appeared on a Thursday. I know because I wrote it down. I'd come in from the north pasture with a thrown shoe situation on one of the work horses, and I stopped at the water trough near the house to cool my face, and I heard them through the kitchen window, not arguing, nothing like that, but something with more friction than reasonable. Eli had apparently shown Nara a drawing he'd done of his mother. He'd done this, I gathered from context, without warning, just presented it to her in the kitchen after breakfast, the way children do when they're not being cruel but also haven't yet learned to calibrate the weight of what they're carrying. She had longer hair, Eli was saying, but I made it shorter because I can't get the long part right. A pause. Can I see? Nora asked. You already are. I mean, may I hold it? Another pause, then, you can look but not hold. I heard Nora say quietly, she looks kind. Eli said nothing for a moment. Then, she used to call me her best idea. I had to step away from the trough. I couldn't write fast enough and I didn't trust my face. That afternoon, Caleb found out about the drawing. I think Eli told him, because Eli was at an age where everything important had to be reported, processed, cross-referenced. And I saw Caleb stand very still by the corral gate for a long time after, looking at nothing in particular, jaw working slightly. That evening, he knocked on the door of the room where Nara was doing mending. I don't know what was said. I only know that when she came out 20 minutes later to bring Eli his evening cup of warm milk, her expression had shifted by some small degree. Like a door that had been held at a specific angle was now held at a slightly different one. Not open, not closed, different. The second week, Caleb started leaving the kitchen before breakfast was finished. The third week he stopped. I watched this without comment, the way I watch most things, with my logbook and my policy of pretending to be focused on something else. What I noticed was the moment when Eli began telling Nara things at the table. Not important things. Small things, an ant colony he'd found near the east outbuilding, a cloud that had looked like a horse, a question about whether stars had names in Apache or only in the language settlers wrote down. That last one stopped the table. Caleb looked up from his coffee. Nara set her fork down. Some, she said carefully. The ones that mattered for navigation, the ones that were part of stories. What stories? Eli asked. She looked at Caleb. This was the moment. I know this because I was watching from the window with a pretense of checking the latch, when she was asking permission for something that hadn't been specified in any contract. Permission to be more present than the arrangement required. Caleb held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he reached for his coffee and said, "Go ahead," to the cup rather than to her, but it was meant for her. She told Eli about the star that the Apache called the one that doesn't move, and how hunters used it to find north, and how there was a story about a young man who followed it so long he forgot the way back, but also forgot what he was afraid of. Eli listened with his chin in his hands, and his eyes wide, and his breakfast getting cold. Caleb listened too. He didn't look up from the coffee, but he listened. I wrote in my log that night, something is changing. I can't say what yet. But the quality of the silence in that house is different, like the difference between a held breath and a settled one. By the end of the first month, I had observed the following, in no particular order of significance. Caleb had fixed the handle strap on her canvas bag. He'd done it quietly, left it on the porch chair, said nothing about it. She'd seen it, said nothing back. Used it the next time she went to the root cellar. Nara had found Caleb's logbooks, his ranch ones, not mine, the ones he kept of cattle counts and weather patterns and water table levels going back 7 years, and read through the margins, where he'd occasionally written a line or two that weren't about cattle at all. Things like E asked about the shape of lightning today and wind from the north all week, makes the house sound different at night. She'd asked me very casually if he'd always done that. I said yes, since before Margaret died. She'd nodded and asked me nothing else, but her expression was the complicated one she used when she was adding something to a calculation she'd been running for a while. Eli had started sleeping a little later in the mornings, which Caleb told me meant the boy was comfortable. First time in 2 years. These were small things, I wrote them all down. But the night of the thunderstorm was not a small thing. It came up fast from the southwest, the way the worst ones do in high desert country. No apology, no gradual warning, just a sudden change in the air's character, and then the sky going the color of a bruise and the rain hitting the roof like it had an argument with it. Eli woke screaming. Nightmares, he'd had them since Margaret died, worse in storms, and Caleb's usual approach was to go in and sit with him until it passed, which sometimes took an hour, sometimes took until morning. But I'd seen Caleb that afternoon. He'd taken a bad fall off Reddick while cutting fence line. Nothing broken, but something in his shoulder pulled wrong, and he'd been moving stiffly all evening. I don't know if he heard the scream through the pain or despite it, but when I looked from the bunkhouse window toward the house, I could see through the lit window that he was halfway to Eli's room when Nara got there first. She was already in the doorway, already saying something I couldn't hear over the rain. Caleb stopped. He stood in the hallway and watched her, watched Nara settle onto the edge of Eli's bed, watched her put a hand on the boy's back in the steady, circular way that quieted him within 2 minutes, when it usually took Caleb an hour. And I could see from the window, even from that distance, the specific way Caleb's heart stood still. Not reluctant, not relieved, something harder than either. The storm ran for another hour. Caleb went back to his room. But I wrote in my log, he didn't go to his room right away. He stood there a long time first, watching. I found out the next morning what had been said, because Eli told me himself while I was mending harness in the barn. Nara told me a story about rain, he said, not looking up from the cat he was petting with intense concentration. What kind? About how the Apache believe rain is memory, that the sky holds water the same way people hold grief, and when it gets too heavy it has to come down. He paused. She said that's why storms feel personal, because they are. I set down the harness. That helped, I asked. He considered it the way only 7-year-olds consider things, with their entire face. It made the thunder feel less like something angry, he said, more like something sad. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I picked the harness back up and said, "That's a good distinction." He went back to the cat, I went back to the harness. And in my logbook that night I wrote one sentence, underlined twice. She is not helping to run this house, she is carrying part of it. June came in dry and difficult. That's not unusual for high desert country. Dry and difficult is what June does. It's what June is for. It's the month that separates the people who were serious about the land from the ones who were romantic about it. The water table dropped. 2 sections of fencing blew down in a windstorm. One of the 3 calves born that spring developed a lung sickness that required more attention than a sick calf justifiably deserved, but which Caleb gave anyway because he was that kind of man, the kind who didn't allocate his care proportionally. I was watching all of it. I was also watching something else. The arrangement between Caleb and Nara had settled into a shape, but the shape kept shifting, the way water in a vessel looks still from a distance, but if you watch closely, there's always some small adjustment, some imperceptible seeking of its own level. They'd found a working rhythm. The house ran. Eli was fed and tutored and told stories before bed and was visibly, measurably less hollow-eyed than he'd been in March. The accounts were better managed. Nara had a head for numbers that Caleb hadn't expected, and that he'd acknowledged with the particular awkward gratitude of a man who doesn't like being surprised by how much he needed something. But underneath the function, under all the careful management of tasks and schedules and polite exchanges, something else was running. And it was starting to surface, the way underground water surfaces in dry country, quietly, in unexpected places, in moments that neither of them had budgeted for. It surfaced the first time on a Tuesday that I have noted in my log as the irrigation argument. Caleb's irrigation system, hand-dug channels, inefficient, a holdover from when there'd been more men on the ranch and more hands available, was failing in the southeast pasture. I'd known this. He'd known this. We talked about it, him and I, in that specific way where two people agree something needs doing without committing to when, which means it slowly becomes urgent and then crisis. Nara had been watching the water situation with the particular attentiveness she brought to anything that touched the land. She had not said anything about the irrigation for 3 weeks. I know this because I was paying attention to what she chose not to say, which was often more informative than what she did. Then one morning she drew something on the back of a supply list and left it on Caleb's work table. It was a diagram, a redesigned channel layout. She'd been out to the southeast pasture at some point, walked the slope, and calculated a revised grade that would carry water from the eastern spring further and more efficiently, using a series of shallow curves rather than the straight channels Caleb had dug. She hadn't said do this. She hadn't said your way is wrong. She'd just drawn it, left it, gone back to the kitchen. He found it mid-morning. I was patching a saddle in the barn when he came in, holding the diagram. "This hers," he said. "I assume so." He looked at it for a long moment. His finger traced one of the curves. She surveyed the pasture. "I saw her out there Tuesday morning early." He said nothing. He took the diagram with him. That afternoon he was in the southeast pasture with a shovel. He'd modified the first channel to follow her suggested curve. Not all of it, just the first section, testing it. I watched from the ridge. 2 days later, he modified the second section. He never mentioned the diagram to her. She never asked. But one morning over breakfast she said, without particular ceremony, that the grass color in the southeast corner looked better, and he said that the water table there had been poor and they'd made some adjustments, and she nodded as though they was the right word, which it wasn't and which they both knew. I wrote, neither of them will admit to anything. This is going to be a problem or a marriage, I can't yet tell which. The second surfacing was more serious. It involved a man named Grover Sands, who ran the adjacent property to the east, and who had what I'll describe charitably as a complicated relationship with the changes that had been happening in the territory since Apache families started settling near non-reservation land. He was not a violent man. He was something worse, a man who expressed his convictions entirely through implication, through the slow application of social discomfort, who believed that the line between what he said and what he caused other people to feel was someone else's responsibility. He rode over in the 3rd week of June. He knew about the arrangement. Everyone in 20 miles knew about it, the way things spread in country where there isn't enough happening to dilute information. He came under the pretext of a fence line question. He stayed longer than the fence line required. I was there. I was always there in my specific way, present but off to the side, ostensibly occupied. Sands spoke to Caleb about the fence. Then he looked at the house and said, "Arrangement working out, is it?" in a tone that held everything his words technically didn't. Caleb said yes. Sands said, "Well, it's not conventional, but these are unconventional times." He said it with the smile of someone who wants you to understand that conventional is the operative word. Caleb said, "What else can I do for you, Grover?" Sands stayed another 10 minutes on topics of no importance, and then rode out, and Caleb stood watching him go with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since the dry months after Margaret. A flat, exhausted look, like a man who has used up a specific kind of energy. He came to the barn afterward, didn't speak for a while, just checked Reddick's shoe, which didn't need checking. I waited. "You think she heard?" he finally said. I'd been watching the house. Nara had been in the kitchen, visible through the window. "The window was open," I said. He made a sound that wasn't a word. "She's been managing this kind of thing since before she arrived here," I said carefully. "I expect she's better equipped for it than either of us." That's not the point, he said sharply and then stopped himself. Reddick shifted under his hands. I don't want her, he stopped again. The sentence had an ending he wasn't ready to say out loud. I don't want her to have to, he said finally, differently, quieter. I didn't write anything in my log that night. Some things need to settle before you put them into words. Nara did not raise the subject with Caleb. But 3 days later, she began teaching Eli some words in Apache. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't framed it as a lesson or a request. She'd simply been doing mending on the porch one afternoon when Eli came out and asked what she was humming, and she'd told him it was a word song, a way her grandmother had used to remember things, and she'd taught him the first 4 words: water, horse, stone, sky. I heard this from the porch steps where I was oiling boots. I made no indication that I was paying attention. I was paying very close attention. When Caleb came back from the north pasture that evening, Eli met him at the gate and said, very seriously, 4 words in Apache. Caleb looked at him, looked past him at Nara, who was at the porch railing with the expression of someone prepared for any response on the full spectrum. What does that mean? Caleb asked Eli. Water, horse, stone, sky, Eli said, proud the way children are proud of new things physically with his whole body. That's what I learned today. Caleb looked at Nara for a long moment. She met it, steady, waiting. Tomorrow, Caleb said to Eli, ask her what the word for thunder is. He went into the house. Nara let out a breath, very quietly, not for anyone's benefit, just her own held air released. I wrote in my log, he is not afraid of what she is. He is afraid of what he's becoming. There's a difference, and it matters. July arrived and the lung-sick calf died. Caleb found it in the morning, Monday, first week of July, before breakfast, and he dealt with it the way he dealt with every loss on working land, practically, without ceremony, without complaint. He removed the calf. He told me what needed doing. He came in to breakfast and sat down and drank his coffee. Eli didn't know until later. The calf had been the boy's special interest all spring. He'd named it, which Caleb had gently discouraged, and which hadn't taken, named it Roster, because of the way it had a dark stripe along its side that Eli thought resembled a list. He'd visited it daily with the specific devotion of a child who needed something to focus care on. When he found out, he went to his room and didn't come out. Caleb stood outside the door for a long time. I know because I could see from the end of the hall when I came to tell him something else, and saw him standing there and quietly left. It was Nara who sat in the hallway outside the door. Not inside, she didn't go in, didn't knock. She sat against the wall in the hallway with her mending on her lap, close enough that when Eli eventually opened the door 2 hours later, she was simply there. He didn't deserve to be sick, Eli said from the doorway. No, she said. It's not fair. It isn't. Papa says the land doesn't do fair, it does true. A pause. Your father is right about that. Eli sat down in the hallway beside her, back against the wall the way she was sitting. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't push. What did the Apache do? He said eventually. When animals died. It depended on the animal, she said, and what it had meant to them. What would they do for a calf called Roster? She thought about it. They'd remember what the calf gave them while it was alive, the way it moved, the things it made them notice. Eli was quiet. He made me notice how calves' ears move when they're thinking, he said. Both ears separately, like they're listening to 2 things. That's worth knowing, Nara said. Is it worth losing him for? She didn't answer immediately. She let the question be what it was, a real question. The kind that 7-year-olds ask with the unsettling precision that children have before they learn to soften things for politeness. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe it's not about worth. Maybe it's just he was here, and now he isn't, and you're the person who knew about the ears. Eli leaned his head against the wall and looked at the ceiling. I'm going to write it down, he said, so I don't forget. She handed him a piece of paper from the edge of the mending pile. He went back to his room. She sat for another while in the hallway, alone. I turned around and went back the way I'd come. I wrote in my log that night, and my handwriting was poor, and I didn't care. She is not only carrying part of this house. She is carrying part of these people, and they don't know how to tell her what that means. I'm not sure they know yet. I'm not sure she's letting herself know. Caleb found the paper on Eli's desk that evening, the one Nara had given him from the mending pile. He read what Eli had written. I don't know exactly what it said, but I know that he sat on the edge of Eli's bed for 20 minutes after the boy fell asleep, and when he came out he went to the kitchen, which was Nara's territory in the evenings, and he said something I only partially heard through the window screen. He said, "I don't know what to call this." She was at the table, hands around a cup of something. She said, "Neither do I." A long pause. He said, "I thought I was being practical." She said, "I know. I need you to know that He stopped, started again. The arrangement was what I thought I needed." She didn't say anything. It's not another stop. I don't know how to revise what I said I needed without making you feel like what it meant has changed. Very quiet. Has it changed? He didn't answer immediately, and in the pause, in the space of a man trying to locate a feeling in territory he'd sworn off mapping, I heard the real thing. The thing that had been building in the margins of every logbook entry I'd made for 3 months. He said finally, "Yes." She didn't respond. I couldn't see her face. He left the kitchen. She sat for a long time with her cup. I closed my logbook and went to bed, and I didn't sleep for a while. August is when high desert country commits. The heat stops being polite about what it wants. The land goes to its final brown, the shade-seeking kind that makes everything look biblical. The work on a ranch in August doesn't pause for anything. Not sentiment, not uncertainty, not two people trying to determine the distance between a contract and a feeling. And the relentlessness of it is, I've come to believe, part of the mercy. You can't sit in your complicated feelings when there are water levels to manage, cattle to move, fences that don't care about your interior weather. Caleb Hart was, in August, the most relentlessly functional I'd seen him in 3 years. He worked from before dawn to after dusk. He fixed things that had needed fixing for a year. He checked and rechecked the irrigation channels, all of them now following Nara's curved grades, though he still hadn't said so directly. He was present at every meal, present for Eli's evening reading, present at breakfast with his coffee and his careful attention and his expressions that had been, over the summer, becoming slightly less controlled. Not much, just slightly. He was a man trying very hard not to want what he wanted, which is the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show until it does. The precipitating event, if you want to call it that, and it was both smaller and larger than that word implies, happened on a Thursday in the second week of August. Nara received a letter. I know because I was the one who picked up the mail in town, and I saw the Santa Fe postmark, and I could tell from the handwriting, angular, slightly cramped, that it wasn't someone writing with good news. I gave it to her without comment. She read it at the kitchen table before breakfast, and I was there for no particular reason, except I was often in the kitchen before breakfast because Nara made coffee that was considerably better than what I made in the bunkhouse. She read it twice, folded it, set it on the table. Her face did something careful and contained and ultimately unsuccessful, the way faces do when the thing they're controlling is bigger than usual. "News from Santa Fe," I said. "My cousin's husband," she said. "The household I left, he's offered me a position." She paused. "A real one. His wife's sister is moving and they need someone to manage the house, with pay, not an arrangement." I heard what was under the word arrangement. "Will you go?" I asked. She looked at the folded letter. "I don't know," she said, and then more quietly, "That's the problem." She hadn't known, I realized, that it was a problem. She'd arrived in April thinking this would be temporary regardless, a bridge to something more stable, more conventional, more hers. She'd planned at some level not to stay. She'd kept one bag. She'd mended the strap but never unpacked fully. There was a quality to her presence in the house that I'd noticed and never named. She'd made herself useful, she'd made herself cared about, she'd made herself necessary, but she hadn't made herself permanent. Like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment when the arrangement would reveal its true limitations, its ceiling, its edge. And now Santa Fe was offering a floor. And she didn't know what to do. She didn't tell Caleb about the letter. Not that morning, not at lunch, not at dinner. I watched the shape of her at the table and in the yard, slightly different, like something had shifted 1 degree in her internal compass. Eli noticed. Children notice before they understand. He was quieter that evening, watching her with the specific solemnity of a child whose instincts are running ahead of his reasoning. Caleb noticed too. I watched him notice, which is its own particular kind of watching, the side glances, the moment when he started to say something and didn't, the quality of his attention when she passed through a room. He came to the barn that evening. "Something wrong with Nara," he said, with the directness of a man who's decided pretending not to notice is costing him more than asking. She had a letter from Santa Fe. The way he went still, from her cousin's husband, an offer of employment. Very quietly, what kind? Household management, paid position, real contract. I paused, different than this one. He turned away from me and did something with a saddle that didn't need doing, and I let him. After a while he said, "Is she going to take it?" "She doesn't know," I said. "That's what she told me this morning." "What does she want?" I looked at him. He was looking at the saddle, but the question had been aimed at something much larger than me. "Caleb," I said carefully, "that might be worth asking her." He said nothing. "I mean to say, I think the answer to what she wants may depend on information she doesn't currently have." He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that fills itself. "I wrote a contract," he said. "I specified terms." "You did?" "That's a specific kind of promise. She came here on the back of that promise. She organized her life around it." He paused. "If I say something different now, if I've changed what I want from what I wrote down, I can't." He stopped. "I can't revise it without her consent. I can't just shift the ground she's standing on." I looked at him for a moment. "She's standing on shifting ground either way," I said. "The letter's already done that." He looked at me. "You could give her something solid," I said. "Or not, but the ground's already moving." He went to find her. I know this because I followed at a careful distance that I will not describe as eavesdropping, but which was adjacent to it in ways that don't require elaboration. She was in the garden behind the house, the small one she'd started in May, the one nobody had told her to start but which had simply appeared, herbs and a few vegetables carefully tended. She was there in the early dark with a lantern, checking something along the irrigation channel, Caleb's original channel, actually the one she'd redesigned and he'd quietly rebuilt, and she heard him coming but didn't turn immediately. He stood at the edge of the garden. "I heard about the letter," he said. She turned then. The lantern made everything specific. Her face, the shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there in April, the way she held the lantern slightly away from herself, as though she didn't want it too close. "Danny told you," she said. "Yes. I wasn't hiding it." "I know." He stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the channel. The water ran between them quietly. "Are you going to go?" She looked at him for a long moment, the looking that was her version of Caleb's stillness, both of them being people who needed a moment before a true answer. "I don't know," she said. "The position in Santa Fe is what I came to the territory to find, something stable, defined." "This isn't defined enough." His voice had an edge he didn't intend. "It's defined as an arrangement," she said precisely. "A household partnership agreement." She paused. "I know what that is. I came here knowing what that is. I wasn't confused about it." "Were you unhappy with it?" A long pause. "No," she said, "that's the problem." He looked at her across the water. "Nara." She waited. He stopped. The particular stopping of a man who hasn't used certain language in 3 years because the last time he used it was so close to a loss that the words still carry the shape of the absence. "I'm not good at I don't." He made a sound that wasn't a word and was more honest than most words. "What I started this as," he said slowly, "is not what it is now. I know that. I know that I made something that's not in the contract anymore, something I didn't plan for. I didn't plan for Eli to be." He stopped. "I didn't plan for a lot of things." "What are you saying?" she said, quiet but direct. "I'm saying that if you go to Santa Fe because you need something real, something with proper footing, I understand that. I wrote you a contract and I'll honor it, whatever you decide." He paused. "But I want you to know that I would, if you were open to it, I would write a different contract. I would make it." He exhaled. "I want it to be different. I want to ask you to stay differently than I asked you to come." The lantern between them, the water between them, the dark high desert sky above both of them. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that I stopped breathing. "What does Eli want?" she said. "He doesn't know anything about this. He knows something is happening. He went quiet at dinner." Caleb almost smiled. "He notices everything." He paused. He told me last week that the house sounds different than it used to. I asked him how. He said it sounds like someone's in it. She absorbed this, looked down at the irrigation channel, looked back up. You understand, she said carefully, that I have been preparing myself since April to leave when the time came, because I have always had to. She stopped, reorganized. I am good at leaving before things end. It is a skill I developed because the alternative was worse. What's the alternative? Being left, she said, simply, devastatingly. Caleb stood very still. I came here, she said, because I needed ground under my feet. I stayed because, she stopped again. Because the ground here turned out to be different than I expected. The people were different. She looked at him. You were different. Different good or different? Different than I was prepared for, she said, which is not the same thing as difficult. It is only, she looked at the lantern flame for a moment, steadying something internal. It is only that I didn't budget for this. Neither did I, he said. A long moment. The star that doesn't move, she said. He looked at her. The one I told Eli about, the one hunters used to find north. She paused. My grandmother said it was reliable not because it was fixed, but because everything else moved around it. And if you watched it long enough, you stopped being afraid of the moving. He looked at her for a long time. Are you asking me to be a star? He said, and there was something in it, not quite humor, not quite vulnerability, but something that lived right on the border of both. I'm asking you to stay still, she said, long enough for me to stop preparing to leave. The water moved in the channel between them. He said, I can do that. I wrote in my log that night with terrible handwriting. She is staying, I think. He asked her, or she asked him, or they both asked each other the same thing at the same time, which is its own kind of answer. Eli doesn't know yet. He'll figure it out before they tell him. He always does. The contract will be revised, or discarded, or turned into something else, the way things that start as arrangements sometimes become what they actually were all along, once enough time passes for the practical language to fall away. I have been keeping this log since April. My handwriting has gotten consistently worse every month, which I take as evidence that the important things are happening faster than I can manage them. I'll need a new logbook. This one's almost full. The formal revision happened on a Saturday in late August. Not in Orvin's office. Caleb wanted no part of that. But at the kitchen table, on an evening when Eli was in bed, and the house was the specific quiet of a place where someone had finally stopped holding their breath. I wasn't there for the paperwork. That was between the two of them. What I was there for was the moment after, which I know about because I was on the porch and the kitchen window was open. They sat at the table. The new document between them, simpler than the first, considerably shorter, containing language that wasn't the language of household partnership agreements and domestic management and services rendered. Eli appeared at the kitchen door in his nightshirt at some point, because children in houses always know when things are happening, even in their sleep. He looked at his father, he looked at Nara, he looked at the paper on the table. What's that? He said. Caleb looked at Nara. Nara looked at Caleb. Something passed between them in that look, not words, not explanation, just a shared acknowledgement that the answer to the boy's question was going to be a more complicated truth than either of them had started this year expecting. It's a new plan, Caleb said. Eli looked at Nara. For what? She looked at the boy. This boy who had held his mother's drawing with both hands. This boy who had sat in the hallway with her and named what a dead calf had taught him. This boy who had asked what the Apache word for thunder was and who fell asleep learning it. For the house, she said. And for staying. Eli processed this with his 7-year-old face, serious, concentrated, thorough. Then he said, Are you going to stay? Yes, she said. He looked at his father, who nodded. Eli looked back at Nara. Good, he said. I was going to tell you the word for moon tomorrow. I didn't want to waste it. He went back to bed. Nara's expression did something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one, something warmer, something that had been waiting in the wings of her composed face all summer, and was only now permitted to move toward the center of it. Caleb reached across the table and turned the document toward her for signing. She signed it. He signed it. They sat for a while in the kitchen, in the quiet of a house that had learned, gradually and imperfectly, to hold more than one set of memories. Outside, the windmill turned in the night breeze. The irrigation channel carried water through the curved grades she'd drawn and he'd built. The garden behind the house was still. The herbs and the small vegetables settled for the night. I left the porch before either of them came out, because some moments aren't for witnesses. I'll tell you what I know and what I don't, and where the difference is. I know Nara sent a letter to Santa Fe declining the position. I know she added one more line to her response to the cousin's husband, a line he shared with me much later, secondhand, when I happened to be in town. The ground here is different than I expected. I am learning to stand on it. I know that Eli learned the Apache word for moon that next day, and the day after that asked for the word for home, and that Nara told him the word, and then told him that in some versions of the language there is no separate word for home and for the direction back to it. They are the same concept. I know that Caleb laughed at this. Actually laughed, a short, genuine thing that startled Eli into delight and made Nara look away for a moment, adjusting to the brightness of it. I know the ranch is better run now than it's been in 4 years. I know the water runs through curved channels. I know Eli's nightmares come less frequently. What I don't know is whether any of this was what either of them thought they were agreeing to in the beginning. I don't think it matters. I think the thing that happened between them was always larger than the agreement that started it, the way rivers are always larger than the channels that first held them. I'm writing this in October in a new logbook beside a fire that the weather now requires. The house across the yard has lights in 3 windows. Supper was finished an hour ago. Somewhere inside there is conversation. I can hear the texture of it, not the words, and the particular quality of it is the one I noted all the way back in the first month. The one I said was like a held breath becoming a settled one. It is settled now. I could call this a love story. I've been resistant to that framing because both of them would disown it, Caleb, because he still expresses himself primarily through irrigation channels and fixed straps, and showing up. Nara because she still keeps a portion of herself back, the way people who have learned caution keep it even when caution is no longer needed. But maybe that's what love actually looks like in a high desert ranch in the hard months of the territory. Not the clean, announced thing, but the one that builds itself out of water-level calculations and mended handles and children learning new words for old things. Not the romantic version, the true one.